Hare Krishna, everyone. Really glad to be back. And today we're going to start with Canto 3 today. How auspicious. So before I do that, I'm going to just review what we read in the last chapter of Canto 2. And um, so if you recall, so it's been a few months ago in Canto 1, chapter 13. Uh, we read about how Vidura, he returned home after many years of pilgrimage. The title of that chapter was Dhritarashtra Quits Home, you may recall. So when Vidura came into the palace, everyone he was coming back after a long, long time, some 30 years or so. Then everyone was so thrilled to see him because he was so loved and he was so respected by all the palace residents, all the relatives. And but what Vidura did not return just to receive the love of the Pandavas. This was, of course, after the Kurukshetra war when Pandavas had won and Yudhishthira was on the throne. So his purpose was not to come back to receive that love again, but he had a specific purpose for coming. And that purpose was to preach very strongly to Dhritarashtra in order to get him out of the palace. And why? Because Dhritarashtra was very old and yet living in great comfort, but not understanding that he was soon to die. So Dhritarashtra was heavily influenced by the preaching of Vidura. So in the middle of the night, he and his wife left the palace in a very noble way, and to practice yoga. So Vidura had performed this task of saving his brother very nicely. But in Canto 1, actually, there was no explanation by Shukadev Goswami or by Sutta Goswami why Vidura had left the palace. And there was no explanation what he had done after that. And also about his meeting with Maitreya Muni, which will be explained in Canto 3 and 4, in this Canto and 4. So um, in Canto 3, we will hear that after hearing from Maitreya Muni, after his meeting with Maitreya Muni ended, he decides to go back to Hastinapur to free Dhritarashtra and rescue him from living a palace life. So we're going to hear about these parts now in Canto 3 very soon in the future chapters, things that were not answered in Canto 1. So after the events in chapter 3, Canto 1, where Vidura goes to give advice to Dhritarashtra, many other things were described in Canto 1, in first canto, in the frame of reference of how Krishna left the planet. He left the planet and the Pandavas retired, and then Kali Yuga came, and Maharaj Parikshit was cursed, and he went to the bank of the Ganga to hear Srimad Bhagavatam from Shukadev Goswami. And in the process, he asked many questions. And mostly those questions were about creation. So most of second canto was about creation, to answer Parikshit Maharaj's questions. Now, at the very end of the second canto, which means chapter 10, which is the last chapter of Canto 2, the sages, after hearing so much about the creation and the Lord's material energy, they bring the topic back to the 13th chapter, where they ask about Vidura again. So we will read the last 3 verses of second canto, just the translation. So this leads us to a first slide, prelude to this chapter. The sages ask 3 questions. Now these 3 verses are from chapter 10, Canto 2. Text 49 and 50. Shonaka Rishi said, "Let us know, please, what topics were discussed between Vidura and Maitreya, who talked on transcendental subjects, and what was inquired by Vidura and replied by Maitreya. Also, please let us know the reason for Vidura's giving up the connection of his family members and why he again came home. Also, please let us know the activities of Vidura while he was in the places of pilgrimage." So his talks between Vidura and Maitreya is going to be discussed afterwards. And what's going to be discussed here, a part of this chapter is going to deal with why Vidura left the palace and gave up all the things that were familiar and comfortable. He had lived there all his life, and why he left that to go on pilgrimage. So, where did he go on pilgrimage? This part also will be answered in this chapter, the places that he visited, and up to the point of his meeting with Maitreya Muni, with Uddhava first. So, only up to that. He really actually doesn't meet Maitreya Muni in this chapter. So many of these questions will be answered here. These two questions will be answered here. So it's a very, very interesting chapter. Very, very gives us very deep insights into Vidura's mind and how he thinks, the mind of a pure devotee. Okay, so text 51. Sri Sutta Goswami explained, I shall now explain to you the very subjects explained by the great sage in answer to King Parikshit's inquiries. Please hear them attentively. So when the sages ask these questions, Sutta Goswami is going to relate what he heard when he was in the assembly near the Yamuna, where Shukadev Goswami was speaking to Parikshit Maharaj during the last 7 days of his life. Because these same questions were asked by Parikshit Maharaj to Shukadev Goswami. So in text 3 of this chapter, the Parikshit Maharaj asks Sukadev Goswami, where and when did the meeting, so we have just the same question, but this is being asked originally by Parikshit Maharaj. When and where did the meeting and discussion take place between Saint Vidura and His Grace Maitreya Muni? Kindly oblige, my lord, and describe this to us. Purport, Prabhupada writes, a short purport. Exactly as Shaunaka Rishi inquired of Sutta Goswami, and Sutta Goswami replied, so Srila Shukadev Goswami replied to King Parikshit's inquiries. The king was very anxious to understand the meaningful discussion that took place between the two great souls. So this takes us to our next slide. Shukadev Goswami gives history of Kauravas' atrocities against the Pandavas. Now, this is answering that question. What was the reason why Vidura left the palace? So in order to answer that question, Shukadev Goswami is going to give a brief history of what happened that led to this event. And the history we're quite familiar with, all the atrocities that the Kauravas did upon the Pandavas. So in this text, from verses 5 to 9, I'm just going to read a couple of them. Sri Sutta Goswami said, the great sage Shukadev Goswami was highly experienced and was pleased with the king. Thus being questioned by the king, he said to him, please hear the topics attentively. So now, so the questions are here, and Shukadev Goswami is going to answer them. Now, just so that we don't have to go through all the verses of the different atrocities that the Kauravas did on the Pandavas, I can just summarize some of them. So, first of all, what was discussed between Maitreya Muni and Vidura, it will be actually answered in 30 chapters, which means 30 chapters of Canto 3 and 4. This conversation, this wonderful conversation between them. And what it was all about, it was all about Krishna. But before he's going to talk about, he's going to explain about the occurrences in the palace that caused Vidura to leave and go on pilgrimage. How Dhritarashtra had usurped the kingdom and had usurped the kingdom because he wanted his own son to become king. So because of that, Pandavas were given so much trouble since they were given under the care of Dhritarashtra. So under the plans of Duryodhan, they tried to kill the Pandavas just to make Duryodhan the king. Can you imagine the kind of mentality? But it's not very unusual, right? We see that how In the material world, family attachment is so strong that one is willing to do any kind of sinful activities just to further the benefit of one's family. One, one doesn't even think twice. The parents, they are so blinded by this love for their children that they're willing to commit any kind of sinful activities. And one can see, and if you look around even among your family members and relatives, you'll see those things happening. It's a very common sense. For Dhritarashtra to feel like that feels very bad, but yet it's not unusual, right? So he was feeling he wanted to become Duryodhan to become the king instead of Yudhishthira Maharaj. And there's a real story about how this whole thing happened. That how Yudhishthira was born before Duryodhan. It just happened quite just very amazingly and how Gandhari was actually very upset, even though she's a really a wonderful personality, and Prabhupada gives a lot of praise to her. But at that moment, having a natural love for her son, she was really upset because she knew that he would not be king, and so she really hit her uterus really hard, her womb really hard, and that made the child, the embryo was came out in 100 pieces or something, and this is how she had 100 sons. So anyway, so this is, but it so happened it was Krishna's will that Kunti gave birth first to Yudhishthira Maharaj. So this was really eating Dhritarashtra up, and he felt that first of all he could not become king because he was blind, and so with the premature death of Pandu, he made himself king, even though he was blind. And then another pain in his heart was this: his son was not to be king. So that was also, so his desire, his material desire to make that happen, in spite of the events, then that led him to really to actually do very sinful things. In other words, cooperate with Duryodhan to try to get rid of the Pandavas. So, and one of the major sinful things that Dhritarashtra succumbed to was that he did not stop Draupadi's disrobing after the gambling match. And then on top of that, and during the gambling match, of course, he was given the order, all the Pandavas were meant to go to the forest for 13 years and 1 year, which would be in disguise, incognito. And he did that to keep his word. And finally, when he came back, he asked for his share of the kingdom, and Duryodhan said no. Yudhishthira said that this was how was this to happen, because by profession they were Kshatriyas and they must rule. So if you cannot give half of the kingdom, so at least give us 5 villages. And what did Duryodhan say? I cannot even spare even land to put a needle through. And Yudhishthira, being such a noble soul, he did not immediately attack with war like one would have done. And he sent Krishna as a peace envoy to the Kauravas. And we know the story that even though Krishna is the Supreme Lord and he is not a messenger, anybody's messenger or chariot driver, yet he did that for the love of his devotees. He was reciprocating the affection, the deep affection that he had for the Pandavas. So the Supreme Lord went and approached Dhritarashtra and Duryodhan, and he asked them, please do not fight. Please compromise. But Duryodhan, rather, he captured Krishna. And Krishna, of course, displays his spark of wonder, his Virata Rupa. But yet, after all this, they did not agree. And after that, at this point, Dhritarashtra called Vidura to his room, and because they were like brothers, and asked him what to do, because war was impending. It was looming. And in the next 3 verses, we're going to hear what Vidura tells him to do. And that's verse 6. Sri Shukadev Goswami said, King Dhritarashtra became blind under the influence of impious desires to nourish his dishonest sons, and thus he set fire to the lacquer house to burn his fatherless nephews, the Pandavas. The king did not forbid his son Dushashan's abominable action of grabbing the hair of Draupadi, the wife of the godly king Yudhishthir, even though her tears washed the red dust on her breast. Yudhishthir, who was born without any enemy, was unfairly defeated in gambling. But because he had taken the vow of truthfulness, he went off to the forest. When he came back in due course and begged the return of his rightful share of the kingdom, he was refused by Dhritarashtra, who was overwhelmed by illusion. And then text 9 talks about how Lord Krishna was sent by Arjuna, as a peace envoy. So now we'll move on to the next slide. Vidura's advice was rejected. Duryodhan insults him. So his good advice that we just heard was rejected by Dhritarashtra. And on top of that, Duryodhan insults him. When Vidura was invited by his elder brother, Dhritarashtra, for consultation, he entered the house and gave instructions which were exactly to the point. His advice is well known, and instructions by Vidura are approved by expert ministers. Text 11. Vidura said, You must now return the legitimate share to Yudhishthir, who has no enemies and who has been forbearing through untold sufferings due to your offenses. He's waiting with his younger brothers, among whom is the revengeful Bhima, breathing heavily like a snake. Surely you're afraid of him. So he's giving him the picture that what are you dealing with? You're dealing with these 5 powerful brothers, especially Bhima, who has taken a vow to kill every one of your sons and to drink their blood, right? That's what he vowed after Draupadi was attempted to be disrobed. Lord Krishna, the personality of Godhead, has accepted the sons of Pritha as his kingsmen, and all the kings of the world are with Lord Shri Krishna. He is present in his home with all his family members, the kings and princes of the Yadu dynasty, who have conquered an unlimited number of rulers, and he is their Lord. So he's also reminding them that who are you dealing with? Lord Krishna is their friend, and who is Krishna? The Supreme Personality of Godhead. And then Krishna has all his family members, the powerful Yadus, and all the kings who have been conquered by these Yadus. They're all ready to be on the side of the Pandavas. So you're playing with fire, basically, he's telling them. So we'll move on to our next slide. A good son versus bad son. This is verse 13, basically, of the purport. Prabhupada explains about the qualities of a good son versus a bad son. Verse 13. You are maintaining offense personified, Duryodhan, as your infallible son, but he is envious of Lord Krishna. And because you are thus maintaining a non-devotee of Krishna, you're devoid of all auspicious qualities. Relieve yourself of this ill fortune as soon as possible and do good to the whole family. It's a very interesting purport. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but just a small part of it. First of all, Prabhupada explains that a good son, offers pinda, after his father's death. Why? Because if the father was not a devotee, and he's going to get the sinful results of his sinful activities, then of any fruitive activities, then he offers his pinda in order to relieve him of those reactions. So offering pinda really means offering to Lord Vishnu to satisfy him in the name of the Father. So that is a good son. And so if the son is not a devotee, then how can he make an offering to Lord Vishnu to save his father? How can he do that, right? So basically it is to save the father from going to the lower planets, basically. So, but then Prabhupada in the next paragraph of the poetry describes that he actually quotes Chanakya Pandit, and I'll read that part. According to the moral instructions of Chanakya Pandit, what is the use of a son who is neither a learned man nor a devotee of the Lord? If a son is not a devotee of the Supreme Lord, he is just like blind eyes, a source of trouble. A physician may sometimes advise the extrication of such useless eyes from their sockets so that one can be relieved of the constant trouble. Duryodhan was exactly like blind, troubling eyes. He would be a source of great trouble to the family of Dhritarashtra, as foreseen by Vidura. Vidura therefore rightly advised his eldest brother to get rid of this source of trouble. Dhritarashtra was wrongly maintaining such personified offense under the mistaken impression that Duryodhan was a good son, able to liberate his father. So there's another story in the Bhagavatam about King Anga, when he realized that his son Vena was really abominable. Even as a child, he was killing his friends. Then he decided when there was no hope, first the sages tried to change his heart, give him higher advice. But then when he realized that this nothing was going to change, he just left. He gave up his, just quietly, he gave up. One evening, he gave up everything and he left home before anybody could notice that the king had left. And so these great souls, they understand that, one has to, for the greater good, one should be very careful that one should not entertain a bad child if that's against the religious principles, basically. So, text 14. While speaking thus, Vidura, whose personal character was esteemed by respectable persons, was insulted by Duryodhan, who was swollen with anger and whose lips were trembling. Duryodhan was in company with Karna, his younger brothers, and his maternal uncle Shakuni. So, this is where he got his bad association and his ideas. It is said that giving good counsel to a foolish person causes a fool to become angry, just as feeding milk to a snake only increases its venomous poison. Saint Vidura was so honorable that his character was looked upon by all respectable persons. But Duryodhan was so foolish that he dared to insult Vidura. This was due to his association with Shakuni, his maternal uncle, as well as with his friend Karna, who always encouraged Duryodhan in his nefarious acts. Text 15, Duryodhan continues. Who asked him to come here, this son of a kept mistress? He is so crooked that he spies in the interest of the enemy against those on whose support he has grown up. Toss him out of the palace immediately and leave him with only his breath. These are heavy, heavy words. He's calling him an infidel, that you are eating my bread, but yet you are on the side of the Pandavas. So you're betraying us. But in his heart, Prabhupada writes in the purport that Duryodhan knew that Vidura was not an ordinary person, that he was a great soul and well-wisher of the Kauravas. So Vidura was a well-wisher for both sides. But being a devotee, he could see that the Pandavas were virtuous and the Kauravas were evil. But in spite of knowing that, he used strong words against his innocent uncle, Prabhupada writes. So he wanted him to be tossed out in a very rude way, with nothing, with no possessions, and just his breath, it said. Of course, Vidura, being a very noble person, before he voluntarily gave up everything, immediately walked out and left his bow. Of course, Vidura was surprised and shocked at Duryodhan's words, but yet he knew that this is meant to be. So this will take us to our next slide. Vidura saw harsh words of Duryodhan as mercy of the Lord, verse 16. Translation. Thus, being pierced by arrows through the ears and afflicted in the core of his heart, Vidura placed his bow on the door and quit his brother's palace. He was not sorry, for he considered the acts of the external energy to be supreme. Beautiful purport, this one. Prabhupada explains that he could understand that the act of Duryodhan was mercy of the Lord. It's coming in the form of mercy for him. Just like in the story of Parikshit Maharaj, when the curse happened, Parikshit Maharaj did not protest it. He took it upon his head and saw it as the mercy of the Lord. So what Prabhupada is explaining, that what was happening, the way Vidura understood what was happening with Duryodhan, was the Lord's external energy was acting on him. It was the influence of Maya, of course. And therefore, he was carving his own path towards ruination, towards going to hell, right? A pure devotee can see things for what they are. He has a very, very kind heart, a very compassionate heart, and generally he's a well-wisher for even his enemies. But that does not make him blind to understand what's happening and who's wrong and why one is behaving in this way, right? So it's due to the external energy of the Lord. It's Krishna's Shakti that covers people up, right? He therefore is part of this purport by Srila Prabhupada. He therefore considered the acts of the external energy to be supreme. Yet he also saw how the internal energy of the Lord helped him in that particular situation. So the external energy was acting on Duryodhan, but Lord's internal energy was acting on him. A devotee is always in a renounced temperament because the worldly attractions can never satisfy him. Vidura was never attracted by the royal palace of his brother. He was always ready to leave the place and devote himself completely to the transcendental loving service of the Lord. So he was internally always wanting to serve the Lord all the time and to give up all these worldly things. But one has to wait and one has to do one's prescribed duty. Now he got the opportunity by the grace of Duryodhan, and instead of being sorry at the strong words of insult, he thanked him from within, because that gave him a chance to live alone in a holy place and fully engage in the devotional service of the Lord. So that we'll move on to our next slide. Now this is where Vidura will begin travel, because he just left Hastinapur. Vidura travels, hears about the end of the Yadu dynasty, and meets this great soul, Uddhava. So the translation: by his piety, Vidura achieved the advantages of the pious Kauravas. So what's happening here is that after leaving Hastinapur, he took shelter of many places of pilgrimages, which are the Lord's lotus feet, with a desire to gain a high order of pious life. He traveled to holy places where thousands of transcendental forms of the Lord are situated. So Vidura is leaving the comforts of his palace life, where he has lived all his life, not just for a little time, but all of his life, completely now dependent on the Lord. And in each place, he visited the temples of Lord Krishna. So Vidura's thinking was that he did not want to be limited to just material piety, which means doing one's prescribed duty. Of course, our ultimate prescribed duty is to love and serve God. But he did not want to just do the religious formularies that brings material piety, but he went for spiritual piety of a different kind. And what was this spiritual piety? Going to and visiting places of pilgrimage. But then Prabhupada points out, what do you do in these places of pilgrimage? It's not about sightseeing. Going to a pilgrimage place means hearing from the great saintly souls, hearing Srimad Bhagavatam, doing some service, observing festivals, worshipping Tulsi, hearing Krishna's name, offering flowers and incense to Krishna, cleaning the temple, any of these things, Prabhupada says, brings spiritual piety, which is like putting money in the bank account, little by little, and eventually by doing regularly, one becomes a wealthy person. Of course, all these results of all these spiritual piety is enhanced when one does it in the holy dham. However, a temple anywhere is the holy dham, or even a home can become a temple. So all these activities must be done at any whichever situation we are in. So this will take us to our next slide, the Lord's deity form as good as himself. And this is taken from verse 18 purport. First, I'll read the translation. He began to travel alone, thinking only of Krishna, through various holy places like Ayodhya, Dwarka, and Mathura. He traveled where the groves, hill, orchard, river, and lake are all pure and sinless, and where the forms of the unlimited decorate the temples. Thus, he performed the pilgrim's progress. The Prabhupada writes about the archer murtis, how they are non-different from the Lord. He says that there's no difference between the potencies of the archer and those of the personal forms of the Lord. And then he gives a beautiful analogy that we can explain to our children, and it becomes very effective and understandable. That how to bring home the point that deities are non-different from the Lord. So it's the example of the post boxes, which we have all over the city, mailboxes, which do the same work as one would go into a post office to mail a letter. So these archamurtis can deliver the same unlimited potency of the Lord as when he's personally present. And there's a story, this beautiful story of Sakshi Gopal, which really brings home that point with children, that how the Lord's deity form is non-different from the personal form of the Lord, how the deity walked thousands of miles behind this devotee to help him keep his promise, to help the older Brahmana keep his promise. Such a nice story to give that faith about the form of the Lord. While so traversing the earth, he simply performed duties to please the Supreme Lord Hari. His occupation was pure and independent. He was constantly sanctified by taking his bath in holy places, although he was in the dress of a mendicant and had no hair, dressing, nor a bed on which to lie. Thus, he was always unseen by his various relatives. So Prabhupada explains in the purport, the foremost duty is when we go to the holy places, we must satisfy the Supreme Lord and his devotees. It's not about pleasing, the world or society, but it's about, and all the formalities, but it's about pleasing the Lord. It's a very sanctified place. Text 20, thus when he was in the land of Bharatvarsha, traveling to all the places of pilgrimage, he visited Prabhas Kshetra. At that time, Maharaj Yudhishthir was the emperor and held the world under one military strength and one flag. So this Prabhas Kshetra is near Gujarat. And this is the place where the Yadus had killed each other. And there was the end of the Yadu dynasty. And again, a very wonderful purport in which Prabhupada writes that how people, modern historians can take history back to only maybe 3,000 years into the past. But we know from Vedic history that the world was, even prior to that, much even prior to that, the world was under the flag of Maharaj Yudhishthir, who was emperor of the world. Right? And he compares it to the hundreds and thousands of flags flapping in the United Nations. But under Yudhishthira Maharaj, there was only one flag. So you can see how powerful these rulers were due to their benevolence. Due to them being a pure devotee of the Lord, they were able to keep the whole planet under them. At the place of pilgrimage, this is text 21, at the place of pilgrimage at Prabhas, it came to his knowledge that all his relatives had died due to violent passion, just as an entire forest burns due to fire produced by the friction of bamboos. After this, he proceeded west where the river Saraswati flows. So this is where he hears about, the Yadavas killing each other. And again, a very wonderful purport in which Prabhupada compares the friction of forest bamboos to that of passionate human societies. The wars and all the quarrels and conflicts that happen due to human passions in human society. He's comparing that with the friction of two bamboos that creates a forest fire. So nobody can ever trace the cause of a forest fire. In the same way, it's impossible to find out why these quarrels and these conflicts happen among people. It's due to passion, right? So therefore, in the same way, the Yadus, due to they were in this situation due to the influence of the external energy. And how can we extinguish, Prabhupada explains, how can we extinguish this worldly fire is through the mercy cloud of rains. In the same way, the conflicts and quarrels in this world can be extinguished by the mercy of the pure devotees. So he's still traveling. Text 23, there were also many other temples of various forms of the Supreme Personality of Godhead Vishnu, established by great sages and demigods. These temples were marked with the chief emblems of the Lord, and they reminded one always of the original Personality of Godhead, Lord Krishna. So again, we understand that the symbol on the top of the temple, the chakra, by which one person can know that, oh, there's a temple there. As soon as we see that symbol, even from a long distance, we remember about Lord Krishna. And this form, this routine was always done for the longest time in the history of the world. It's nothing new. Even so many years ago, 5,000 years ago, this was the chakra was constructed on top of the temples, and even today is going on. So this will take us to our next slide. Who is Uddhava? The Lord's intimate relationship with him. So this is this is taken from the purports of 24, text 24 and 25. I thought these are very important points to know about Uddhava since he's being introduced here. And to hear a little bit about him. So text 24, thereafter he passed through very wealthy provinces like Surat, Sovira, and Matsya, and through western India, known as Kurujangala. At last he reached the bank of the Yamuna, where he happened to meet Uddhava, the great devotee of Lord Krishna. So Prabhupada explains who Uddhava was. And first of all, he explains the tract of land which is so very sacred, where Vidura is going through. Why are these names coming up? Because this is where he went, and these are very holy lands. And so Prabhupada in the purport, he talks about this tract of land called Vrindavan and Mathura, and why it is so holy. And even today, he mentions how people some people who are there, they're looking for Krishna. They're living in separation from Krishna. And these are the pure devotees who take shelter of the holy dham and who are always in separation from Krishna. And he gives the example of the Goswamis. They went roaming all the places of Vrindavan. What were they saying? Hey Radhe, where is son of Nanda Maharaj? Where are they? There. And they were doing 24 hours kirtan. And then he describes about Uddhava. Who was he? He was an associate of Krishna in Dwarka and was very intimate to Krishna. He was a very dear friend of Krishna, and he was very intelligent. One time after the battle, it was getting time for Krishna to wound up his Leela. And the demigods visited Krishna in Dwarka, and Brahma indicated to Krishna that the time had come for him to return. Krishna had set seed for his departure. After the sacrifices were performed, Krishna had suggested that the sages go to Pindaraka, a holy place, and perform pious activities because Kali Yuga was going to start very soon. So this is leading up to why the fact that as to why the Yadus killed each other. So Krishna, because Kali Yuga was coming, Krishna asked all his relatives and all the people in Dwarka to go to this holy place to do pious sacrifices, because to ward off the Kali. And at that time, Sambha, one of the sons, the son of Jambavati, one of the queens of Krishna, he dressed as a pregnant woman just for the, for playing a trick to the sages. He dressed as a pregnant woman, and all his friends went to the sages and asked them to predict whether it's a boy or a girl. The sages became very upset, and they cursed that inside you will have an iron club. And they actually, lo and behold, when they opened it, he had an iron club. So they went to Ugrasena, who was the king of the Yadus, and he ground up the whole thing, the whole iron club, and he into powder practically, and they put it in the ocean. And this iron filings, these powdered like iron filings, it swept to the shore of the Prabhashetra, and they grew to be iron canes, really iron canes that grew near the shore. And that one piece of iron, but there was one piece, so when they were pounding it, there was one piece left, of iron. This was eaten by a fish, and this fish was found by a hunter called Jara. And when he cut open the fish, he found this iron head, and he said, "Wow, this is really good." And so he made it he carved it into using it as the top of his arrow, the spearhead actually. And the story goes that this was, by the way, this was the spearhead by which he shoots Krishna on the feet. And it's said that Krishna, in this way, Krishna left for the eternal abode. So these iron filings, it became canes, and one day, under the influence of alcohol, a wine, these Yadus, they picked up these iron canes and started beating each other with them and fighting with each other. And then Krishna and Balaram came, and they started, attacking Krishna and Balaram. Of course, Krishna and Balaram were very powerful, and they killed them all. And this way, there was this the whole Yadu dynasty. Then it talks about how Uddhava, then when Krishna, this desire was fulfilled of Krishna's, where he wanted the demise of Yadu dynasty, because these were very personal, powerful personalities, Krishna's own family members. And they had to go back to where they came from. And a lot of them were demigods who had taken birth to help Krishna, assist Krishna in his pastimes. And then Krishna, he wanted to leave. So this was his plan, that the Yadus leave first ahead of him, and then he sat under this banyan tree. And we may have heard this story. It comes up in the 11th canto, that when Krishna was sitting, of course, Uddhava will come and see him here first. And Uddhava, when he hears that Krishna is going to leave, because all the omens are showing that, everything was showing, pointing towards that, the disappearance of the Yadus. So he goes to Krishna, and he's feeling great separation, and he tells him, "Please take me with you. I can't live without you." And Krishna tells him, "No, you go, you go to Badrika ashram and give this my message to them." And then at that point, Uddhava says that, "No, but I don't understand your message. I don't know your message." And Krishna, in the 11th canto, he gives the Uddhava Gita, a very wonderful section of the Bhagavatam, where he gives the Uddhava Gita. He gives basically Gita to Uddhava, and in this way, Uddhava agrees to go to Badrika ashram. And then Krishna goes and sits under this banyan tree, and the hunter Jara, he's thinking that his beautiful lotus feet is the head of a deer. He shoots an arrow, and of course, to the outsiders, to non-believers, it appears that Krishna was killed and he was in pain and there was blood, but actually there was nothing of that. And Krishna just went up, and of course, at that time, Daruka came, Krishna's personal chariot driver, and he came with a beautiful chariot, and Krishna went on that chariot back to the spiritual world. And of course, before he leaves, he gives instructions to Daruka to go to Dwarka and tell the family members that Krishna is departing and that they should immediately, and that Dwarka will be actually inundated with a great flood. So they should leave Dwarka immediately. Krishna. This is, and of course, we will hear more in this chapter about how Uddhava meets Vidura, why we are actually speaking about Uddhava, is because he actually much a description in the later chapters about these events in the 11th canto. The Yadu dynasty is really wanted this pastime to be enacted. Okay, so this will take us to our next slide. Vidura asks Uddhava about the welfare of his relatives. So this is, I think, the last slide. So this is verse 26 to 42, the Yadus and about their demise, and he already knew that. And Prabhupada explains why he does that is because it's a psychological reason why he asked those questions.
Hare Krishna Mataji.
Rather than anything. 25.
Mataji, your voice is cracking in between.
Krishna?
Hare Krishna Mataji. Mataji, the voice is cracking in between. So.
Oh, okay. Mm. We do that. Krishna? Anyway, disconnected. Hare Krishna.
Yes, Mataji, it is audible now.
Everybody.
Mataji, in between it becomes, it is cracking in between. So if something can be done.
And it's what's the reason actually? So, Hare Krishna.
Yes, Mataji. Mataji, we could not hear you.
Hare Krishna. Can you hear me?
Yes, Mataji. Okay. Now it's audible.
Okay. And we are still on YouTube, yeah?
Yes, Mataji.
Okay. So this is a slide about sound. I have to understand that what Vidura's relationship with Uddhava was. Uddhava, Prabhupada explains in the purport that he was older than Uddhava. Vidura was older than Uddhava, like a father. And therefore, when the two of them met, Uddhava bowed down before Vidura. And Vidura embraced him because Uddhava was younger, like a son. So really, Vidura's brother Pandu was Lord Krishna's uncle. And Uddhava was a cousin to Lord Krishna. Relationship. And here Vidura is asking Uddhava about the welfare of his relatives. So the Prabhupada explains in the purport that it's actually natural to love your family members, especially if they're devotees. So therefore, Vidura is relative. So they were all, so they were all devotees, and therefore connected to Krishna. So we see how these pure devotees, because everything that they were, their whole life was connected to Krishna. So we'll see how Vidura's inquiry is also in connection with Krishna. So he's asking about. So I think we can, verses where he's asking about one after another. He surprisingly he does not ask about Dhritarashtra. Why? Because and to free him from that, external energy of the Lord. And there's a few verses how he also glorifies Supreme Lord Krishna. So I'll stop here, and I can open it to questions. Whoever has any questions. I don't know if the connection is good, Rati. Is the connection okay?
Now it's okay, Mataji.
Now it's okay.
You,
Yes, Mataji,
really?
we can hear now.
Okay.
So devotees can please raise their hands if they have any questions.
Okay. Otherwise, we can go to your presentation, Rati.
Okay, Mataji.
Why don't you? Yeah.
Yes, Mataji. In the meantime, they will think about questions also if anybody has.
Okay, so go ahead. Yeah, you think about that.
Yeah, so thank you, Mataji, for telling us deep qualities about Vidur and how we can actually learn a lot from these saintly people. And the presentation was very self-realized based, realization based. Now sharing the guidebook part. This chapter begins again with a story summary, wherein it starts with Sukdev Goswami smiled. His disciple King Parikshit was destined to be bitten and killed by a snake bird. And with only a few days left of his life, the king had chosen to sit and hear the Srimad Bhagavatam from Shukadev Goswami. Despite his situation, the king was untroubled. In fact, he was blissful. and his eager questions were endearing. Shukdev related to King Parikshit a conversation between Vidur and sage Maitreya Rishi. What more can I say about the house of the Pandavas? Said Vidura with a smile, lost in thought. Lord Krishna loved their home. So it is again so meaning the story pattern is always conversation based, and children can actually, even if we read the story loud, children can see it happening in front of their eyes. The story narration style is such, and the pictures are also given so that children can relate to the pictures as well. Then there are key messages which can again help children to memorize the important verses and to discuss about them further and to apply them in their lives. Then we have understanding the story based questions, which can again help us to understand how well children have taken the chapter. And then there are higher order thinking questions, which actually help children to go deep into the purpose and apply the philosophy in their lives. We can always keep a record of these higher order thinking questions before we read the translations, and children can be helped to probe while uh, reading the translations. And then we have activities. So first analogy activity, a very beautiful one, is wherein a comparison is made between post office and post box in relation to deities and the actual form of Krishna. So deities are non-different from Krishna. Similarly, the post box is non-different from post office. So here children can be encouraged to address a self address card can be posted, one in a letter box in a post box and another in a post office, and children can actually see that both the letters will come to their own address, because even the post box has the same potency as the post office, because it is legalized, registered, for taking the post and getting it delivered. Similarly, the deity form is non-different from Krishna, and it has the same potency as Krishna himself. And then there is another activity of sugar candy, a reflective activity, wherein children, it is just the analogy is related that how the message of Godhead is always like nectar to devotees, but it is just the opposite to non-devotees. Like for example, when Krishna was Krishna went as a peace messenger, and he was giving he was his words were understood and heard by some like Bhishma, who were pure devotees, but others were not taking it very seriously. Then this verse is given, and then children are to reflect on this analogy. What is compared to sugar candy? To whom did sugar candy feel sweet, and why? So children can actually go deep into this analogy and understand it better through these probing questions. And then we have this riverbank diorama, wherein children are the entire scene wherein the conversation was taking place between Vidura and Maitreya is Vidura and Uddhav is to be depicted in a form of diorama, wherein background children, these my daughters have taken a small dollhouse box, and they have made Yamuna scene, and two trees have been shown which are beautifully described how to make those trees in the guidebook itself. And then they have, from clay, they have made two figures of Uddhava and Vidura, and how they are discussing the topics. So like this, children can do these artistic activities also. And then there are introspective activities wherein qualities of Vaishnavas are highlighted, 26 qualities, and children have to think about a particular quality which attracts them, and then they have to think how they can develop this quality and a personality which they think had these qualities. So this is one way to go deep into understand the qualities of uh, the devotees and how they can actually develop those qualities. So when these kind of discussions happen, children actually reflect upon these qualities and they automatically tend to feel that these qualities are worthy, of emulating, and how they actually reflect upon how they can inculcate these qualities. So it also helps children to develop good qualities of devotees. And then there is this activity of react and respond, wherein this is again a discussion based activity wherein children are supposed to see how Vidura did not reacted but responded to the situation. So similarly, there are certain situations and children, these kind of reflective questions actually help children to reflect upon their own behavior, not in a way that we pinpoint their behavior in the through these activities, but in a very subtle manner they tend to realize that yes, they could have reacted differently, or they could have responded rather than being reactive in a situation. So this was very nice. When we had discussion, I had discussion with my own daughters. Describe a situation in which someone insulted you or hurt your feelings directly or indirectly, even though you were doing the right thing. So this normally, in everyday life also these kind of situations happen. So what were your emotions? Did you react or respond? If you reacted, how could you have used the situation to benefit by responding instead? Discuss some practical tips to overcome your reactive or defensive nature when you are provoked. How can we practically develop the quality of responding and not reacting, just like Vidura did? So this is how children can actually, through these reflective and introspective questions, children can actually, we can see gradually how their behavior also tend to be more, more they do not react to situation, then they think about it, and then they can relate to these situations. It happens very subtly, but the changes can be seen. And then there are writing activities wherein children have to write a paper describing 5 or more places which Vidura visited on his pilgrimage. A map can also be drawn, and children can actually map those places like Prabhat Kshetra in Gujarat, and then Uttar Pradesh, showing the Ganga flowing, and river Saraswati also. So this was another activity wherein children can actually, it is also, children will also get mapping skills through it, and they will actually write a short paper on all the important places that were visited by Vidura. And then there is language based activity, which is a word search, wherein the words are given and children have to search them in the box. And then this wonderful poetry, toss him out with only his breath, the wicked and cruel Duryodhana said. Vidura left his bow at the door and walked out of the Hastinapur. He traveled the earth both far and wide, remembering Krishna all of the time. From beautiful Ayodhya to fortress of Dwarka, sweetest Mathura and Prabha Kshetra. So like this, the poem goes on, and children really love enjoying these kinds of poems. They sing again and again, and through these poems only they are learning philosophy and so many aspects of spiritual life. And then there are the answers to all the questions, story based and analogies. So that's it. Thank you all very much. And now we can see if we have questions. Mataji, some thank you messages are coming, but there are no questions today, so everybody seems to
Okay,
be.
that's fine. That's fine. Yes. So we'll do the next chapter next week, chapter 2 of Canto 3. Thank you all for joining very much. Hare Krishna.
Hare
Hare Krishna Mataji.
Hare Krishna.